Before the world even knew the word Viking, something strange and brutal happened on a lonely Baltic shore. The year was around 750 AD, decades before their longships would terrorize Europe. Along the icy coast of what is now Estonia, a battered warship lay half buried in the sand, not a grand vessel of glory, but a broken craft hastily covered in earth. Inside it, 7 warriors rested, their bones telling a story of violence, desperation, and beginnings. Who were these men? Why were they buried in their ship, far from home? And what do they have to do with the rise of one of history's most feared forces? Today, we dig into the chilling origins of the people who would soon be called the Vikings. Imagine standing on a rocky shoreline in Scandinavia around the year 750 AD. The air is cold, sharp enough to sting your face, and the ocean stretches out like a sheet of gray steel under a restless sky. This is a world before the Viking Age, before the iconic horned helmets you've seen in pop culture. By the way, those horns are a myth, but something is already brewing. Here, along these unforgiving coasts, a new kind of people is taking shape. They're not called Vikings yet. The word Viking itself won't even become common until decades later, and it'll be used more as a job description than a name, referring to raiding, trading, and adventuring far from home. These early groups. Scholars often call them proto-Vikings, a kind of preview of the storm that's about to sweep across Europe. And they're not just wandering around, they're organized, they're ambitious, and they're learning how to master the one thing that will make them famous, the sea. To understand why this moment matters, we have to think about what life was like up here in Northern Europe at the time. Most people lived off the land, small farms, fishing, a bit of hunting. But the environment was harsh. Winters were brutal, summers short, and farmland wasn't exactly generous. Even when the weather cooperated and harvests were good, population growth could make resources feel tight pretty quickly. That scarcity is like a quiet pressure, building year after year, pushing people to look beyond their own fjords and forests for opportunity. And then there's culture. These were warrior societies. Young men were raised with weapons in their hands and stories of glory in their heads. If you were a second or third son with no land to inherit, what were you going to do? Stay home until someone else's fields? No. You'd want adventure, wealth, maybe a chance to carve out your own name. For many of these ambitious young fighters, the sea wasn't just an option, it was the answer. This is also a period when something else changes: technology. Wooden ships had been around for centuries, sure, but these early Scandinavians start experimenting and perfecting designs that will become legendary. Their ships are lighter, stronger, and, most importantly, fast. They can handle open ocean but also slip into shallow rivers, letting raiders or traders travel deep inland. That's a game changer. Because whoever can move faster and farther than anyone else can also strike first and disappear before an enemy even knows what hit them. We actually know this isn't just some romanticized story because archaeology gives us hard evidence. In places like Somme, Estonia, entire ship burials have been uncovered, mass graves of warriors buried with their weapons, their ships, and sometimes even their animals. The way these warriors were buried tells us something powerful. These were organized groups capable of long-distance expeditions decades before the famous Viking raids officially began. So, picture these early proto-Vikings, lean, tough men with swords and axes, traveling in sleek wooden ships across the cold Baltic Sea. They're not yet storming England or raiding monasteries, but they're testing their skills, trading with foreign peoples, sometimes fighting them, sometimes settling among them. They're building networks, learning how to navigate strange waters, how to fight as a unit, and maybe even discovering how profitable violence can be when it's combined with strategy. From a distance, it probably didn't look like much: a handful of warriors going east, maybe clashing with some Finnic or Slavic tribes, maybe selling furs or amber. But history is often like that. Big movements start small, almost invisible, until they suddenly explode. And when that explosion finally comes, when these proto-Vikings evolve into full-fledged Vikings and land on the shores of Lindisfarne in 793, it will shock the Christian world to its core. That single raid will be remembered as the beginning of an age, but the truth is, the story started years earlier, on these windswept coasts, with these ambitious people, quietly preparing to change history. What makes this origin so fascinating isn't just the violence that would follow, but how much it was about survival and opportunity. These weren't people waking up one day saying, "Let's conquer the world." They were people responding to hard conditions, limited land, tough weather, and a culture that rewarded courage and risk-taking. It's easy to look back now and see them as inevitable, but at the time, they were just communities trying to solve a problem, how to live better in a place that gave them very little. And their solution, as it turns out, would change the course of European history forever. To really understand why these early proto-Vikings were willing to risk everything, we have to picture the land they came from. Scandinavia was beautiful, yes, towering mountains, endless forests, and fjords that could take your breath away. But beauty doesn't put food on the table. The soil here was thin and rocky, often covered by ice or stubborn grass that resisted even the toughest farmers. And the seasons? Brutal. You had a short window in summer to plant and harvest, and if anything went wrong, too much rain, too little rain, a late frost, that could mean a long, hungry winter. Imagine being a family in one of those small settlements. Your life revolved around whether or not your crops would survive. Grain, cabbage, root vegetables, simple things that weren't glamorous but kept people alive. One bad harvest and you'd find yourself eating whatever you could scavenge, fish, berries, maybe even bark or moss in desperate times. The margin for error was thin, painfully thin, and then there was the population. You might think, harsh land, few people, right? But that wasn't always the case. In the good years, when the weather played nice and the fish ran heavy in the rivers, people thrived. Families grew. Children survived past infancy. Communities expanded. And before long, the same land that seemed empty was suddenly crowded. There wasn't enough space for every son to inherit farmland, not enough resources to keep every household fed year-round. This creates a unique kind of pressure, one you can almost feel if you imagine living it. You're a young man, strong and restless, maybe the second or third son in your family. Your older brother will inherit the farm, and you'll be left with little or nothing. Are you supposed to stay and work the fields for someone else? Maybe marry into another struggling family and scrape by? For some, yes, that was life. But for others, it wasn't enough. The sea became a kind of escape valve for that pressure. It represented opportunity in a way the land never could. Across that wide, gray expanse of water were other coasts, other rivers, other lands, some of them rumored to be rich, warm, and generous compared to home. Stories of distant wealth trickled back through travelers and traders. There were tales of fertile lands to the east, bustling markets, even soft, wealthy towns to the south that barely knew how to defend themselves. For someone with ambition, these weren't just stories, they were invitations. But leaving home wasn't just about greed or adventure, it was survival. Think about how humans respond to scarcity. We migrate. We've always done it. When food is short, when opportunities dry up, we move. And that's exactly what was happening here. Those proto-Vikings weren't setting sail because life was comfortable, they were leaving because staying meant slow starvation or being trapped at the bottom of a rigid social ladder. This isn't to say that everyone left. Most people stayed put. Communities relied on one another, and life was deeply tied to the land. But enough young, desperate, and daring men took their chances on the sea that it began to shift the culture. Sailing wasn't just for fishing anymore, it was a way to find your fortune, make a name, or even claim land somewhere else. And don't forget, Scandinavia at the time wasn't one unified kingdom. It was a patchwork of small territories, each with its own local leaders, and competition was fierce. If one chieftain or warband started exploring and bringing back wealth, you can bet others noticed. Success bred imitation, and soon more ships were pushing off into unknown waters. The climate itself added another layer of urgency. Some scholars believe that slight shifts in temperature during this period may have made farming even harder. Colder years meant shorter growing seasons and less reliable harvests. The ocean, though, was always there, teeming with fish and offering a road to somewhere, anywhere, that might be better. This is the backdrop for the proto-Viking story, a land both stunning and unforgiving, a place where people learned to be tough because they had no other choice. They developed a culture that valued resilience, adaptability, and, when necessary, aggression. After all, if you live in a place where nature is always trying to kill you, you learn to push back. So when we imagine those first journeys east across the Baltic or later south and west, we shouldn't see them as purely opportunistic raids. They were also acts of desperation and creativity, a solution to a problem no one could solve by staying home. It's easy to judge centuries later and say, oh, they were just plunderers. But if you were that second son, staring at a winter food store that would barely last, watching your brother inherit the only land your family owned, what would you do? That's the question these early sailors answered with action. They took risks, sometimes insane risks, because the alternative, staying home, waiting for a bad harvest or for hunger to tighten its grip, felt worse. And in doing so, they created a pattern of exploration and expansion that would eventually grow into the Viking Age itself. These weren't just warriors with swords, they were problem solvers, innovators in their own harsh way. The same environment that threatened to starve them also toughened them, teaching them how to handle hardship, how to improvise, and how to seize opportunity when it appeared, even if that opportunity was on the other side of a dangerous sea. That's why this piece of the story matters so much. It reminds us that history's big moments don't just come from ambition or conquest. Sometimes, they're born from necessity, from a basic human need to survive and adapt. For the proto-Vikings, the harsh Scandinavian landscape was both their greatest challenge and their greatest teacher, and it pushed them toward choices that would change the shape of European history forever. While the land and the weather were already putting pressure on everyday life, there was another shift happening in Scandinavia, one that might seem positive on the surface but had some unexpected consequences for young men dreaming of their own future. For centuries, Scandinavia wasn't one unified country. It was a patchwork quilt of small kingdoms and chiefdoms, each with its own local leaders, its own small army, and its own way of doing things. Some were little more than clusters of farming villages, loyal to one strong family or warrior chieftain. That kind of fragmented world gave ambitious young warriors plenty of options. If you were tough, skilled with a sword, and hungry for opportunity, you could pledge yourself to one of these local rulers. You could rise through the ranks, earn land or treasure, maybe even carve out your own spot on the social ladder. But by the mid-700s, that was starting to change. The political landscape of Scandinavia was shifting as smaller territories began merging under stronger rulers. Instead of dozens of tiny, competing war bands, there were fewer, larger, and more centralized powers. On paper, this sounds like progress, more stability, bigger armies, and stronger leadership. For ordinary farmers or traders, it probably was good news. Fewer local conflicts meant safer villages and steadier trade. But for a restless young man holding a spear, suddenly, the world felt smaller, not bigger. Think about it. In the old days, if you didn't like how one chieftain treated you, you could pack up and join a rival one. Competition between leaders meant more demand for fighters, more chances to prove yourself and get rewarded. But once those little kingdoms started consolidating, there weren't as many rival leaders handing out land or gold for loyalty. The social ladder tightened up, and the top spots were already filled by the time you got there. If you weren't born into privilege or didn't already own land, you were often stuck at the bottom looking up, with no real way to climb higher. So what do you do when there's no room at the top where you live? You look beyond your borders. And for these young men, looking beyond your borders meant looking to the sea. That's why, at the same time as these political mergers were happening, you see more and more Scandinavians packing into longships, pointing their sails toward unfamiliar shores. The combination of fewer opportunities at home and tales of untapped wealth abroad created a kind of social pressure cooker. We can't overlook how deeply personal this would have felt. Imagine being 20 years old, strong, eager, and raised in a culture that praised courage and achievement above all else. Maybe your father fought for one of the old local rulers. Maybe he told you stories about how he earned his sword and how he planned to pass down land or livestock. But now, the political system is changing, and whatever scraps of influence your family had are disappearing. Your older brother inherits what little property there is, and your life looks like endless backbreaking work for someone else's benefit. It's no wonder so many of these young men said, "Forget this. I'll make my own future." And making your own future, in their world, often meant climbing into a long, sleek wooden ship with a crew of men just like you, people with little to lose and everything to gain. This is where we start to see the DNA of Viking culture forming. It wasn't just about adventure for the sake of it. It was about ambition meeting necessity. When the traditional social and political routes to success closed off, these men didn't simply accept their place. They created new paths, literally, across oceans. The raids and trading voyages that would later define the Viking Age were seated here, during this time when staying home offered no real future. And here's what makes it even more fascinating: those who left didn't always go with violence as their only goal. Sure, there were raiders, but there were also traders, explorers, and settlers. Some sailed east, making contact with Slavic and Finnic peoples, exchanging goods, and learning about far-off markets connected to places like Byzantium and the Arab world. Others scouted new lands in the west, lands rumored to be rich and poorly defended. Whether it was for plunder or trade, the mindset was the same: opportunity was out there, and the sea was the highway to reach it. At the heart of all of this was reputation. In their culture, fame and honor mattered almost as much as wealth. A successful raid or trading expedition wasn't just about filling your pockets, it was about earning a name that people would remember. At home, you might be one of dozens of nameless young warriors with no land and no prospects. But if you came back from a dangerous voyage with treasure, exotic goods, or even stories of bravery, suddenly people noticed you. It's easy to see how quickly this snowballed. One group succeeds and tells their story, and suddenly others want to follow. The lack of opportunity at home wasn't just pushing individuals out, it was fueling a whole cultural movement toward expansion, exploration, and risk-taking. When we look back, we often talk about the Viking Age as if it appeared out of nowhere with the raid on Lindisfarne. But what really happened is that generations of social and political change quietly laid the groundwork for that explosion. Scarce resources, harsh weather, and shifting political structures combined to create a class of people who had the skills of warriors but no place to use them at home. And so they went out to find their own place in the world, on the open sea, far from the shores where they were born. This political shift, though maybe subtle in its day-to-day reality, was one of the key sparks that lit the Viking fire. It took restless young men and gave them two choices: stay home and accept obscurity or take a risk and chase fortune abroad. Many chose the second option, and in doing so, they helped create one of the most famous and feared seafaring cultures in history. All of this ambition, the hunger for land, wealth, and reputation, would have gone nowhere without one thing: ships. And not just any ships, but ships that were unlike anything the world had ever seen before. For generations, people in Scandinavia had been building boats to fish and travel along their rugged coastlines. These early vessels worked well enough for local journeys, but they weren't made for long-distance exploration or lightning-fast raids. That changed when Scandinavian shipbuilders perfected something revolutionary: the longship. The longship wasn't just a boat, it was a technological leap forward, a game-changer that opened doors to the entire known world. Long, narrow, and surprisingly light, these ships could glide through open seas and slip quietly up rivers with equal ease. That versatility made them ideal for what proto-Vikings needed most: speed, mobility, and the element of surprise. The secret to their success lay in a construction technique known as clinker building. Instead of flat planks laid edge to edge, shipbuilders overlapped them, like the scales on a fish. This made the hull flexible and strong, allowing it to handle rough ocean waves without breaking apart while still staying light enough to be hauled ashore if needed. Pair that with a shallow draft, a hull that didn't sit too deep in the water, and suddenly you had a vessel that could slide up shallow rivers or beach directly onto a coastline. Then came the sail. It's easy to overlook today, but adding a single square sail to these ships transformed their range. Before sails, movement depended on manpower, oars and pure muscle. With a sail, you could harness the wind, travel farther, and save energy for when you really needed it, like rowing hard to escape a pursuing enemy or pushing upriver against a strong current. The result was a ship that could cross oceans but also dart up rivers to strike deep inside enemy territory where no one expected an attack. But building one of these ships wasn't simple. You didn't just throw a few logs together and call it a day. A proper longship demanded oak for its planks and frame, strong, durable wood that could withstand the punishing conditions of long voyages. It required iron nails and rivets, carefully forged and hammered into place. The sail needed tough wool or linen, woven tightly and coated to withstand saltwater and heavy winds. Even the ropes had to be high quality, often made from animal hair or plant fibers, twisted and braided by hand. And then there was the human element. A ship like this wasn't useful if you didn't have a crew who knew how to sail it. You needed skilled navigators who could read stars and coastlines, strong rowers who could keep pace for hours, warriors who doubled as sailors, and leaders who could keep everyone moving in sync. In other words, these ships were more than tools, they were floating communities, each one requiring an incredible level of planning, cooperation, and training to function. This is where we see the growing organization of Proto-Viking society. It takes a certain kind of social structure to make longships possible. You need people with enough resources to fund the building, chieftains or wealthy families willing to invest in wood, iron, sails, and manpower. You need craftsmen skilled enough to shape every plank and ironworker to forge every rivet. And you need an understanding of logistics, how to feed a crew on long journeys, how to repair sails and hulls in the middle of nowhere, and how to coordinate attacks or trading ventures far from home. It's hard to overstate what a longship represented in this era. It was both a weapon and a lifeline. For young men looking for opportunity, it was a ticket to a new life. For leaders, it was a way to project power beyond their own valleys and fjords. And for neighboring communities who suddenly found one pulling up to their shores, it was a source of shock and fear. Because a longship meant whoever was on board could appear out of nowhere, strike fast, and vanish before reinforcements could even arrive. One historian once said that the longship gave Scandinavians wings on water, and that's exactly what it felt like. Suddenly, distance didn't matter as much. Rivers that once acted like natural barriers, no longer safe. Islands or monasteries thought to be protected by geography, within reach. Even inland cities, far from the coast, could wake up one morning to the sight of foreign warriors stepping out of sleek, dragon-headed vessels. But there's something deeper about the longship beyond warfare. It symbolized innovation born out of necessity. These ships weren't created just to raid, they were a response to a way of life. Harsh lands forced people to look outward. Limited opportunities at home encouraged risk-taking. And this incredible ship design was the answer, a tool that gave people the freedom to explore, trade, settle, or raid depending on what the situation demanded. Over time, these longships became a cultural icon. They showed up in burial sites like the ones at Somme, where warriors were laid to rest inside their ships, surrounded by weapons and goods. To be buried in a ship was an honor, a symbol that you belonged to this daring seafaring tradition. Even in death, these warriors were imagined as still traveling, still sailing into whatever came next. So, when we think about how the Viking Age exploded onto the European stage, we have to remember that it wasn't just about brave warriors or ambitious leaders. It was about technology meeting social change. Without the longship, without that perfect blend of speed, flexibility, and range, those restless young warriors might have stayed home, frustrated and landlocked. Instead, they had a way out, a way forward, and the tools to make it happen. The longship wasn't just wood and iron. It was freedom, power, and opportunity, all rolled into one elegant design. And it's no coincidence that, once these ships started cutting through the waves, history itself began to change. When we think of Vikings, most of us picture them storming the shores of England or raiding monasteries in Ireland. But those famous Western raids didn't come first. The early Proto-Vikings looked in another direction entirely, east. To the east lay the Baltic Sea, a broad stretch of water dotted with islands and lined with forested coasts. It wasn't as far as England or France, and it offered plenty of opportunity for people willing to take risks. Along those coasts lived the Finnic and Slavic peoples, cultures that had been trading, farming, and fishing in the region for generations. For the Proto-Vikings, these communities were both partners and targets, depending on the day and the mood of the crew. These early voyages weren't casual trips. They were calculated expeditions. Some ships went out to trade, bringing goods like furs, iron, and even simple crafted items to exchange for resources they lacked at home. Others carried warriors, looking to test themselves and see what wealth might be taken by force. The line between merchant and raider was thin, and often, the same people could be both in a single journey. We know this because archaeology gives us hard evidence. One of the best examples is Staraya Latiga, a settlement near the Fokhof River in what is now Russia. By around 750 AD, it had already become a bustling trading hub, and the presence of Scandinavian artifacts there is undeniable. Jewelry, weapons, tools, these weren't isolated finds. They show that Scandinavian people were coming to the region regularly, setting up shop, making deals, and establishing connections far from home. But perhaps the most striking evidence of these early expeditions comes from a site discovered in modern Estonia, the Somme burial. What archaeologists found there was astonishing: 2 ship burials containing dozens of warriors, all clearly Scandinavian, buried with their weapons, tools, and even gaming pieces. These weren't local Estonian farmers experimenting with boat burials, these were outsiders, warriors from across the sea. And here's the thing: they didn't die peacefully. Many of the skeletons showed signs of violent deaths, cuts, breaks, and injuries consistent with battle. This wasn't some gentle diplomatic mission gone wrong, it was a fight, and one that cost many lives. The fact that they were buried together, with such care and ceremony, tells us something powerful about these people. They were organized. They had leaders, rituals, and enough respect for their dead to ensure proper burials even in foreign territory. Think about what that means for a moment. Imagine being part of one of those expeditions. You've left the cold coasts of Scandinavia behind, sailed across the choppy Baltic Sea, and landed in a land you may have only heard about in stories. You're armed, nervous, excited, and you know you're far from home. Maybe you came to trade, maybe you came to raid, or maybe, like many of these expeditions, it was a bit of both. And then something goes wrong. A fight breaks out. People die. And even after that loss, the survivors take the time to bury their comrades properly, laying them to rest in their ships, weapons by their sides, as if sending them on one last journey. This is one of the things that sets these Proto-Viking journeys apart from simple pirate raids. They weren't random acts of violence by a handful of desperate men. These were organized campaigns, with logistics, leadership, and a shared cultural framework strong enough to extend even into enemy territory. They had the resources to build and crew multiple ships, the skill to navigate across the Baltic, and the discipline to carry out their plans, even when those plans ended in bloodshed. And while these early journeys may not have had the same dramatic flair as later raids on England or France, they were incredibly important. They were practice. They taught the proto-Vikings how to work together in hostile environments, how to navigate long distances, and how to balance trade and violence as tools for survival and profit. In many ways, the eastward expeditions were like the proving grounds for the Viking Age. It's also important to remember that these expeditions weren't one-way trips. Many proto-Vikings came back with stories about strange lands, wealthy markets, and new enemies. Word spread. Each successful journey, whether it ended in trade, combat, or both, inspired more people to try their luck. This kind of knowledge sharing was a cultural accelerant, fueling even more exploration and creating a tradition of taking risks on the sea. So, why start in the east? The answer is simple: it was closer, it was known, and it was doable. Before you can raid a monastery on an island hundreds of miles away, you first have to learn how to survive long voyages, how to manage supplies, and how to keep a crew together under pressure. The Baltic expeditions provided all of that experience in a relatively contained environment. But don't mistake these early voyages as small or insignificant. The Somme burial alone tells us these were people prepared to die, and to kill, for their missions. That level of commitment speaks volumes about how serious and organized these proto-Viking groups were, even before the Viking Age officially began. In hindsight, you could say these eastern journeys were like sparks, tiny flashes of ambition and violence that would eventually grow into the roaring fire of the Viking Age. They were the first steps toward a new identity, one that saw the sea not as a boundary but as a highway, a way to reach wealth, fame, and new worlds. And once they mastered those first steps, it was only a matter of time before their sails turned westward, toward an unsuspecting Europe that had no idea what was coming. The success of those early expeditions did more than fill the pockets of young warriors. It reshaped power back home in ways that would permanently alter the course of Scandinavian history. At first, these journeys east were about survival and opportunity, feeding hungry mouths and earning personal glory. But when those crews returned with chests of silver, bundles of furs, exotic goods, and sometimes even captives, something shifted. Wealth wasn't just about comfort, it was about influence. Whoever controlled the expeditions, whoever could gather enough men, build enough ships, and pull off a successful raid or trading venture, suddenly had more than just treasure. They had authority. This is where the small-scale war bands of the Proto-Viking era began to evolve into something much more powerful. Ambitious leaders, often young, charismatic men with a gift for organizing and inspiring others, started using their success at sea as leverage. They weren't content to remain minor chieftains tied to one patch of farmland. They wanted more, and the expeditions gave them the means to get it. Take a name like Bjorn Ironsides, for example. He's one of the earliest Viking leaders to become almost legendary, and while the sagas about him mix fact with myth, one thing is clear: he represented this new kind of power. Men like Bjorn weren't just leading raids, they were building reputations that could unite people beyond a single village or valley. With enough wealth and fame, a man could attract more warriors, buy loyalty, and challenge old political structures that had dominated Scandinavia for centuries. These weren't peaceful transitions, either. Power shifts rarely are. If one leader came back from the sea rich and victorious, his neighbors noticed. Some wanted to join him, others wanted to challenge him. Over time, this constant jockeying for power created a new type of leadership, the warlord. These were men who could project authority not just through inheritance or tradition but through proven ability measured in gold, ships, and loyal fighters. And here's what made these warlords different: their power wasn't limited to one little patch of land. Because they had ships and experienced crews, they could project influence across entire regions. They could control trade routes, secure allies in distant territories, and, if needed, intimidate rivals with the threat of naval raids. For the first time, leadership in Scandinavia wasn't just about who owned the most farmland, it was about who could control movement, commerce, and warfare on a much larger scale. This kind of power had a snowball effect. The more successful a leader became, the more people flocked to his banner. Warriors wanted to serve under someone who could promise not just survival but wealth and glory. Craftsmen and traders wanted to settle near leaders who could protect markets and guarantee safe travel. Communities gradually coalesced around these figures, and their small domains began to merge into larger, more stable territories. In many ways, this was the beginning of a political transformation. Scandinavia had always been fragmented, dozens of tiny chiefdoms, each with its own customs and disputes. But now, there was incentive to unify, at least on a local scale. Why fight your neighbor endlessly when you could join forces, raid foreign lands together, and share the spoils? Success abroad encouraged peace at home, or at least, peace among those who chose to align under a strong warlord's leadership. Over time, these proto-lords laid the groundwork for something bigger: kingdoms. They didn't call them kingdoms yet, but the seeds were planted. The networks of loyalty, the accumulation of wealth, and the military power needed to hold it all together were the same building blocks that future Scandinavian monarchs would rely on centuries later. What began as ad hoc war bands chasing opportunity evolved into semi-stable political entities, strong enough to defend territories, enforce rules, and influence regional politics. But it wasn't just politics that these expeditions changed. The social hierarchy shifted as well. Warriors who had proven themselves in dangerous voyages could rise in status, sometimes becoming landowners or trusted lieutenants under these new leaders. Families tied to successful warlords gained wealth and security, while those who clung to old ways risked being left behind. Even religion and ritual became tools of consolidation, as leaders often used sacrifices and ceremonies to legitimize their authority, presenting themselves not just as strong men but as figures favored by the gods. The creation of this new power structure also gave these communities resilience. Instead of being scattered, vulnerable villages, they began to function as organized networks capable of mobilizing quickly. That organizational skill would become critical later, when Viking raids moved west and encounters with powerful Christian kingdoms demanded an even higher level of planning and unity. Looking back, it's easy to see how those first ambitious young leaders set everything in motion. Without them, the Viking Age might still have happened, but it wouldn't have had the same scale or impact. These early warlords weren't just chasing fame, they were building systems, rudimentary, often violent systems, but systems nonetheless, that would outlast them and form the spine of emerging Scandinavian states. This is why names like Bjorn Ironside still echo today. Whether every story about him is true or not, he symbolizes that turning point, when expeditions ceased to be one-off adventures and became stepping stones to lasting political power. And with that shift, the stage was set for what came next: the westward turn, the famous raid on Lindisfarne, and the full force of Viking expansion. There's another layer to this story that we can't ignore: religion. For the Proto-Vikings, belief wasn't something quiet or private. It was woven into daily life, into leadership, and even into how communities prepared themselves for war and exploration. We often imagine Viking religion through the lens of later myths: Odin, Thor, Freya, and the great halls of Valhalla, but even before the Viking Age officially began, these early Scandinavian societies had a deep spiritual framework. They believed the gods influenced everything: the success of harvests, the outcome of battles, even whether a voyage across a dangerous sea would bring fortune or disaster. And when you live in a world as harsh and unpredictable as early medieval Scandinavia, you look for ways to tip the odds in your favor. That's where rituals came in. These weren't simple prayers whispered over a meal. They were dramatic, community-wide events, gatherings where leaders, warriors, and families came together to honor the gods and ask for their blessing. Offerings were made: food, weapons, animals, and, on rare but powerful occasions, human lives. Yes, human sacrifice. To our modern sensibilities, it's shocking and unsettling, but for these communities, it wasn't about cruelty for its own sake. It was about belief. Sacrificing a life, especially in moments of great uncertainty, like before a major expedition, was seen as a way to secure the gods' favor and protect the group. These sacrifices often involved prisoners of war or slaves, people considered outsiders, but the meaning was the same, a powerful gift to powerful beings, one that would hopefully keep storms at bay, bring victory in battle, or ensure a safe return home. And these rituals weren't done in secret corners. They were public spectacles designed to bring people together. When a chieftain or warlord ordered a sacrifice, it sent a message: I am the one who speaks for the gods. I am the one who ensures our success. It was a tool of unity and, yes, of power. Leaders used religion as both a shield and a sword. They could rally people under a shared purpose and justify risky expeditions by framing them as divinely supported missions. This blending of faith and politics had a profound effect on social cohesion. Communities became tighter, more disciplined. When you believe your leader has the gods on his side, you follow him more willingly. When you watch a sacrifice intended to secure your ship's safe passage, you step aboard with a little less fear and a little more resolve. These shared experiences built trust and solidarity, the kind of solidarity you need when sailing into unknown waters with men who might be your only lifeline in a crisis. It also shaped their mindset for exploration and combat. If you've been told repeatedly that dying bravely in battle could earn you a place in a glorious afterlife, or that the gods themselves favor your journey, you're more willing to take risks. You're more willing to travel farther, fight harder, and endure hardships along the way. Archaeology supports these stories. Excavations of early ceremonial sites have revealed evidence of large-scale gatherings, animal sacrifices, and, in a few rare cases, human remains with clear signs of ritual killing. These aren't just legends, they're snapshots of a culture that truly believed spiritual power could influence real-world outcomes. Religion also gave structure to their growing political systems. Leaders didn't just wield swords, they wielded sacred authority. Some would even claim descent from gods or legendary heroes to strengthen their right to lead. When combined with success on the battlefield or at sea, this religious legitimacy made them almost untouchable within their communities. If your leader is both victorious and blessed by the gods, why would you challenge him? For the proto-Vikings, this was the glue that held their society together during a time of rapid change. Farming communities were transforming into warrior societies. Local chieftains were turning into regional lords. Trade and raiding networks were expanding. Through all of this, shared religious rituals provided a sense of continuity, a way to remind everyone of their common identity and purpose. And so, as these early Scandinavians built their ships and prepared to launch them into the unknown, they did it with more than just physical resources. They carried with them a cultural and spiritual framework that gave them confidence and unity. The rituals, sometimes brutal, always symbolic, were a way of saying, we're ready. The gods are with us. We are one. That unity mattered. Sailing across the Baltic or, later, the open North Sea, was dangerous enough to terrify anyone. Storms could swallow a ship whole. Navigation was rudimentary, and one wrong turn could mean disaster. But when you believe your leader has spoken with the gods and secured their blessing, you board that ship with a different mindset. You're not just risking your life, you're fulfilling a destiny. This spiritual confidence is one of the reasons those proto-Viking communities were so successful in their early expeditions. They didn't just have technology and ambition, they had belief. And belief, when shared by an entire group, can be as powerful as any weapon or sail. By the time these societies evolved fully into the Viking Age, their religious traditions would continue to shape their world. They'd carry these rituals and beliefs with them wherever they went, from the rivers of Russia to the coasts of England. Even when they eventually converted to Christianity centuries later, echoes of this older mindset remained, the value placed on courage, unity, and the idea that life's greatest risks are worth taking when done in the name of something greater. By the late 8th century, something remarkable happened. The gaze of these ambitious seafarers shifted. For years, the proto-Vikings had focused eastward, on the Baltic, on Slavic and Finnic lands, on trade and violent skirmishes that tested their skills. But now their eyes turned west. Why the west? Because it was rich. And more importantly, it was vulnerable. The British Isles, England, Scotland, Ireland, were dotted with monasteries, small religious communities that were often repositories of immense wealth. These weren't fortified castles or bustling cities defended by armies. They were peaceful places built in the name of faith, filled with books, art, gold and silver chalices, and even cattle and farmland. Their inhabitants, mostly monks and priests, weren't trained warriors. They weren't expecting warships to appear suddenly on the horizon. For a culture built on opportunism and boldness, this was too tempting to ignore. The Vikings' longships, perfected through years of trial and exploration, made these raids possible. These vessels could slip across the North Sea faster than anyone expected, landing silently on an isolated coast before anyone even realized what was happening. And once on shore, the plan was simple: strike fast, take what you can carry, and get out before local forces could respond. It wasn't chaos, it was strategy, designed for maximum reward and minimal risk. All of this came to a dramatic head in the year 793, on the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the northeast coast of England. Lindisfarne wasn't just any monastery, it was a spiritual heart of Northumbria, famous for its learning and sacred relics. The monks there lived quiet, isolated lives, focused on prayer and the creation of manuscripts like the beautifully illuminated Lindisfarne Gospels. They were as far removed from war as anyone could imagine. And then, one summer day, the longships came. Eyewitness accounts are scarce, but the impact of that attack reverberated throughout Europe. The monastery was looted, treasures stolen, and some monks killed or taken as slaves. To the Christian world, this was unthinkable. Monasteries were supposed to be sanctuaries, places even kings and warriors respected. The idea that strangers from across the sea would attack such a holy place sent shockwaves through the church and nobility alike. Word of Lindisfarne spread fast, not just because of its brutality but because it symbolized something new, a kind of warfare that ignored the old rules. For centuries, Europe's conflicts had largely been local, predictable, bound by traditions of power and faith. The Viking raid broke those boundaries. It was sudden, it was foreign, and it was terrifying. But here's the thing, it wasn't random. These were not aimless pirates drifting around hoping for luck. The Vikings chose their targets carefully. Monasteries like Lindisfarne were isolated, wealthy, and lightly defended, perfect for the kind of hit-and-run strategy that their longships were built to support. And the choice of easily transportable loot, gold and silver objects, livestock, and, most chillingly, people, made these raids especially profitable. Captives could be taken back and sold as slaves, adding another lucrative layer to their expeditions. The shock of Lindisfarne was so great that later chroniclers described it almost as a biblical plague, a punishment sent by God. In truth, it was a calculated military move by people who had been honing their skills for decades. The Eastern expeditions had taught them navigation, teamwork, and combat discipline. The consolidation of power back home gave them leaders who could plan and finance large-scale raids. The religious rituals and shared belief systems gave them unity and purpose. Lindisfarne wasn't the beginning of Viking ambition, it was its first explosive expression to the Western world. And, of course, once one raid succeeded, more followed. Other coastal and riverine monasteries in England, Ireland, and even France found themselves suddenly vulnerable. The Vikings had discovered a formula: arrive unannounced, strike hard, and leave before anyone could mount a defense. Unlike traditional armies, which might occupy and hold territory, these early Viking raiders weren't interested in staying. They wanted wealth, not kingdoms, at least, not yet. For the people who lived through these attacks, it felt like the world had been turned upside down. These were not the enemies they were used to fighting. They didn't wear the same armor, didn't follow the same rules, and didn't even worship the same gods. They seemed to come out of nowhere, like ghosts or demons summoned from the sea itself. That sense of unpredictability, of danger lurking beyond the horizon, was one of the Vikings' greatest weapons. Looking back, it's clear why historians mark Lindisfarne as the official start of the Viking Age. It wasn't just the violence of that one raid. It was what it represented, a shift from localized exploration and trade to widespread, deliberate attacks on some of the wealthiest and most sacred places in Europe. From that point forward, no coastal settlement felt completely safe. The Proto-Viking era was over. These weren't just restless young warriors looking for opportunity anymore. They were part of a growing movement, backed by technology, social change, and a worldview that embraced risk in pursuit of reward. And with their sails pointed west, they were about to leave an indelible mark on European history. One of the most surprising parts of the Proto-Viking story is how quickly their world opened up once they mastered travel and risk-taking. At first, their expeditions east across the Baltic might have seemed small, focused on nearby Finnic and Slavic communities. But those journeys planted a seed that grew into something much larger, a network of trade and cultural exchange that connected Scandinavia to some of the richest and most powerful civilizations of the time, the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. It didn't happen overnight. These early Scandinavian travelers started by exchanging simple goods with their Baltic neighbors: furs, amber, iron tools, and even handmade jewelry. Over time, their ambitions grew, and their ships pushed farther inland along rivers like the Fokhof and the Dnieper, natural highways that led deep into Eastern Europe. By following these waterways south, they discovered trading posts that linked to the bustling markets of the Black Sea and beyond. And here's where things got really interesting: the Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and the vast Islamic caliphates controlled some of the richest economies of the early medieval world. These were societies producing fine silks, spices, and sophisticated metalwork, fueled by strong urban centers and thriving long-distance commerce. Scandinavian traders, and, yes, raiders, found ways to plug themselves into that system. The goods they brought south were simple but valuable: furs from the endless northern forests, walrus ivory, honey, wax, and one commodity that makes us wince today: human beings. Slavery had been part of European societies for centuries, and the Scandinavians were no exception. Captives taken during raids or bought in one market could be sold in another, particularly in regions where labor was scarce or highly valued. These slaves, alongside natural resources, were traded for silver, coins, and luxury goods unavailable in the far north. This influx of silver was transformative. In Scandinavia, silver wasn't just used for adornment, it became a foundation for wealth and status. Archaeologists have discovered hordes of silver coins, many minted in the Islamic world, buried in Scandinavian soil. That tells us two things: first, that trade routes were established and reliable enough to bring in regular flows of wealth, and second, that this wealth was significant enough to be hoarded, treasured, and sometimes hidden in times of crisis. But silver wasn't the only thing flowing north. These networks also exposed Scandinavians to new technologies, ideas, and cultural practices. From ship design refinements to new metalworking techniques, contact with more advanced economies accelerated their own development. This was the kind of cross-cultural exchange that changes not just economies but entire societies. Suddenly, people in remote Scandinavian fjords were wearing imported silks or using coinage from lands thousands of miles away. It's also worth noting how quickly Scandinavians adapted to this world of commerce. They weren't just raiders, many became skilled merchants and negotiators, learning foreign languages and establishing semi-permanent settlements along trade routes. Places like Staraya Ladiga and later Novgorod became hubs of northern trade, blending Scandinavian, Slavic, and other cultural influences. In these outposts, you could find warriors, craftsmen, traders, and even families, proof that the Proto-Viking movement was about more than just quick raids. It was about opportunity, about finding and exploiting every possible path to wealth. And wealth changes everything. Back home, This steady flow of silver and goods created a stronger, more stable economy. Leaders could now finance bigger expeditions westward, build more ships, and reward loyalty with tangible wealth. Warriors who once fought purely for survival could now hope for a share of actual treasure. This fueled a cycle. More trade and raiding meant more wealth, which meant more power, which in turn funded even larger operations. In some ways, this connection to the Byzantine and Islamic worlds was like plugging into a medieval superhighway. The Scandinavians were no longer isolated, scraping by on thin soil and short growing seasons. They were part of something global, a system of exchange stretching from the fjords of Norway to the markets of Baghdad. And they learned fast. If a particular route was dangerous, they adjusted. If a certain market demanded more furs or more slaves, they supplied them. This flexibility made them both dangerous and highly effective economic players. So when the Scandinavians turned their attention westward, toward England, Ireland, and France, they weren't just a random group of hungry warriors hoping for a lucky score. They were seasoned traders, navigators, and opportunists who had already seen how big the world really was. They knew there were fortunes to be made, and they had the experience and infrastructure to make it happen. This period of Eastern connection also hints at something people often forget: Vikings weren't simply destroyers. They were connectors. They linked distant economies, moved goods and people across huge distances, and accelerated cultural exchange between societies that might otherwise never have interacted. Yes, much of it was brutal, especially the slave trade, but the overall effect was to make Scandinavia more sophisticated, more ambitious, and ultimately more prepared to dominate the stage of medieval Europe. By the time their sails shifted westward in full force, they had something many early medieval societies lacked: a reliable flow of silver and goods to keep their own economy strong and their warriors loyal. The foundation for the Viking Age wasn't just built on violence, it was built on trade, on the ability to navigate complex networks of exchange, and on a willingness to take risks far beyond their homeland. In short, the Proto-Vikings had gone from regional adventurers to international players. And that, more than anything else, explains why their expansion didn't burn out after a few lucky raids. They weren't just raiding, they were building an economic engine powerful enough to fuel decades of exploration, conquest, and cultural influence. One of the most fascinating consequences of the Viking Age wasn't just what the Scandinavians took, it was what they built and what they became along the way. When we think of Vikings, we often picture lightning-fast raids and ships vanishing over the horizon, leaving only smoke and fear behind. And yes, that was part of their story. But another, quieter legacy came from the places where they stayed. Instead of simply plundering and leaving, many Vikings settled, and in doing so, they changed the shape of European life forever. Take Dublin, for example. Before the Vikings, the area was little more than scattered settlements. But the Scandinavians saw potential. They established a fortified base there, not just for launching raids but for trade and administration. Over time, that base grew into a bustling town and eventually into one of the most important cities in Ireland. The same thing happened in England, where York, once a Roman city but later a smaller settlement, was transformed into Jorvik under Viking control. There, Norse craftsmen, traders, and families rebuilt and revitalized the city into a thriving economic hub. These settlements weren't just military outposts, they were melting pots. Scandinavians brought their language, art, shipbuilding techniques, and even culinary traditions. In return, they adopted local farming methods, crafts, and sometimes even legal customs. This blending of cultures created something entirely new: hybrid societies that were neither fully Norse nor fully native, but something richer and more complex. Urbanization was one of the most significant results of this exchange. The Viking presence accelerated the development of towns into centers of trade and governance at a time when much of Europe was still largely rural. Places like Dublin and York became nodes in a growing web of commerce that stretched from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, from the rivers of Russia to the coasts of France and Spain. Markets grew, artisans thrived, and wealth circulated in ways that reshaped local economies for centuries. And culture flowed both ways. The art of these regions began to reflect a unique mix of styles, Celtic knotwork blending with Norse animal motifs, Christian crosses bearing hints of runic design. Even the languages began to intertwine. In England, Old Norse words seeped into Old English, many of which survive in modern English today. Everyday terms like sky, egg, and window trace back to this period of cultural fusion. But perhaps the most profound shift was spiritual. The Scandinavians, who had long followed their own pantheon of gods, slowly began to adopt Christianity. This wasn't a quick conversion or a sudden mass awakening, it was a gradual, strategic change. At first, Vikings viewed Christianity with curiosity or indifference. Some leaders saw the political advantage of converting, as it allowed them to forge alliances with powerful Christian kingdoms and gain access to broader trade networks. Others resisted fiercely, unwilling to abandon the gods who had carried their ancestors through so many storms and battles. Yet, by the 11th century, Christianity had firmly taken root in Scandinavia. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, championed the faith, often by force, sometimes by persuasion. Churches replaced pagan temples, and Christian burial practices began to replace the elaborate ship burials of the past. Over time, even those who once feared the change came to see its benefits: greater political stability, deeper integration with the rest of Christian Europe, and access to new forms of knowledge and art. This wasn't just a change in religious identity, it was a transformation of society itself. The adoption of Christianity meant new laws, new systems of writing, and new ways of thinking about governance and community. It also softened the Vikings' image abroad. No longer were they seen only as terrifying pagans from the north, they became trading partners, political allies, and even rulers in distant lands who shared the same faith as their neighbors. Ironically, the same people who had once raided monasteries like Lindisfarne ended up building churches of their own, funding monasteries, and even sending their children to be educated by priests. The warriors who once sought glory in Valhalla now knelt in prayer, seeking salvation and eternal life in heaven. This shift didn't erase their cultural identity, it evolved it. Many Old Norse traditions persisted, blending with Christian practices to create unique forms of worship and community life. Seasonal festivals that once honored gods like Freyr or Thor were repurposed with Christian meaning, but their roots were still visible in the way people celebrated and came together. So, from raids to cities, from paganism to Christianity, the Viking story is one of transformation. What began as a movement of desperate young warriors seeking opportunity turned into something much larger, a reconfiguration of European culture, economy, and religion. Cities like Dublin and York stand as living reminders of that legacy, places where Viking influence didn't just leave scars but planted seeds that continue to grow even today. When most people hear the word Viking, they picture chaos, ships filled with wild warriors storming beaches, swinging axes, and leaving smoke behind. And yes, those raids were real and terrifying. But if we stop there, we miss what might be the most important part of their story. Their legacy wasn't just about destruction. It was about connection, innovation, and transformation on a scale few could have predicted. The Vikings were not simply destroyers, they were also builders and connectors. Their voyages linked regions of the world that had previously been isolated from one another. From the windswept coasts of Normandy to the deep river systems of Russia, their influence reached far and wide. They didn't just raid and leave, they built settlements, established trade routes, and, in some cases, even founded entire kingdoms. Take Normandy as an example. The name itself comes from Northmen, a reference to the Scandinavian settlers who established themselves there in the 10th century. These Vikings didn't just pass through, they stayed, intermarried with local populations, adopted aspects of French culture, and, in return, influenced everything from architecture to military strategy. That same Norman culture would later cross the English Channel in 1066 under William the Conqueror, himself a descendant of Vikings, and change England forever. Farther east, Viking influence stretched deep into what would become Russia. The Varangians, as these eastern Vikings were called, navigated the great rivers, creating trade and political networks that eventually led to the foundation of Kievan Rus, a state that would evolve into modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Even the elite guard of the Byzantine emperor, the famed Varangian Guard, was made up largely of Norse warriors. The idea that people who once raided monasteries in England ended up protecting the most powerful emperor in the East tells you just how adaptable and influential they were. Their impact wasn't just political, it was cultural and genetic too. In language, countless English words trace back to Old Norse. Words as ordinary as sky, egg, knife, and husband are gifts from that era of contact and cultural fusion. In parts of Ireland, Scotland, Northern England, and Normandy, place names still echo their Scandinavian roots. Genetics tells a similar story. Studies of modern European DNA show traces of Viking ancestry across wide areas, evidence of intermarriage and migration. They weren't ghosts who vanished when the raids stopped, they became part of the populations they once unsettled, shaping future generations in ways that go beyond history books. And then there's technology. The Vikings were master shipbuilders. Their clinker-built longships, with overlapping planks and shallow drafts, were revolutionary. These ships allowed them to travel incredible distances, across open seas and up shallow rivers alike, faster and more flexibly than almost any contemporary vessel. This design would influence shipbuilding long after the Viking Age ended. They were also skilled traders and innovators in everyday life. Archaeologists have found evidence of advanced metalwork, intricate jewelry designs, and even urban planning in Viking towns. They adapted farming techniques from the lands they settled, developed legal systems that influenced later medieval governance, and pioneered methods of navigation that would inspire sailors for centuries. But perhaps their greatest legacy is connection. The Viking network of trade and settlement effectively shrank the medieval world. They linked regions that might otherwise have remained isolated for centuries, Scandinavia to the British Isles, the Baltic to the Mediterranean, the North Atlantic to North America. Yes, even North America. Centuries before Columbus, Norse explorers like Leif Erikson reached the shores of what is now Newfoundland, leaving behind traces of temporary settlements that tell us how far their ambitions could reach. Their religious and cultural transformations also speak to their ability to adapt. The same people who once honored Odin and Thor eventually embraced Christianity, built churches, and integrated into the very societies they had once attacked. This willingness to evolve turned them from feared outsiders into accepted members of European Christendom, ensuring their influence lasted long after the last raid ended. Even today, you can feel their imprint. Cities like Dublin, York, and Kiev still carry echoes of Viking beginnings. Languages still bear their words. Genetic studies still find their legacy in modern populations. And our fascination with them, from television shows to novels to DNA test commercials, suggests that, on some level, their story still resonates. The Vikings remind us of something larger about history, that even periods of violence and upheaval can create unexpected legacies of growth and connection. They began as small groups of people pushed by hardship to seek opportunity abroad. They became a force that reshaped economies, politics, cultures, and even religions across half the known world. So yes, the Vikings were raiders. But they were also explorers, settlers, and innovators who left an indelible mark on Europe and beyond. From Normandy to Russia, their fingerprints remain, in our words, in our cities, in our bloodlines. And that, perhaps, is the most surprising part of all. A people once feared as destroyers are remembered today not just for the chaos they caused, but for the world they helped create. When you pull back and look at the whole picture, the story of the first Vikings isn't just about axes swinging or monasteries burning. It's about survival, adaptation, and ambition in one of the harshest environments on Earth at the time. These were people living in places where winters were long, farmland was thin, and opportunities were few. Yet instead of collapsing under those pressures, they adapted, and in doing so, they changed history. Their story is built on contrasts. On one hand, there was violence. These were warriors who fought hard, traveled far, and, yes, terrified many of the communities they encountered. They attacked religious centers that had once been considered untouchable, and they brought fear to shores that had felt safe for centuries. To their victims, the Vikings represented chaos and destruction. But on the other hand, there was innovation. The same people who raided Lindisfarne also built some of the best ships the medieval world had ever seen. Their longships weren't just fast, they were revolutionary, able to cross oceans and sail up rivers with ease. They took risks, but those risks were calculated, supported by technology and social organization far ahead of their time. And they didn't just fight. They traded, they settled, they built cities like Dublin and revitalized places like York, turning them into hubs of commerce and culture. Adaptation was at the core of everything they did. When resources at home were scarce, they looked outward, first to the east and then to the west. When political opportunities shifted, they formed new alliances, elevated leaders into kings, and transitioned from loose bands of warriors to powerful states. When the Christian world dominated Europe, they didn't dig in and resist forever, they joined it, transforming their spiritual and political identity to better fit the world they were shaping and being shaped by. Archaeological finds like the Somme burial in Estonia give us a window into that world. There, the remains of warriors buried with their weapons tell us these were organized, disciplined people, not just random marauders but members of a culture that valued loyalty, strategy, and honor. Somme and sites like it remind us that history isn't black and white. The same people who buried their dead with care and ceremony were also capable of brutal violence far from home. It's uncomfortable, but it's real. These were human beings, complex and often contradictory, just like us. And maybe that's why the Viking story still resonates today. It's not just about power or conquest, it's about what happens when ordinary people are pushed to their limits by environment, politics, and opportunity. The Proto-Vikings didn't start out intending to build an era that would change Europe. They were simply trying to survive, to find land, food, wealth, and a future. Yet in doing so, they became something bigger. They connected worlds that had been separate. They accelerated urbanization, jump-started international trade, and even helped shape the genetic and cultural map of Europe. They showed what happens when human beings, faced with hardship, refuse to stay still and instead set out to reinvent their destiny, even if it means remaking the world in the process. So when we talk about the first Vikings, we're talking about more than raiders. We're talking about innovators, explorers, and survivors. We're talking about people who faced impossible odds and decided not only to endure but to expand and evolve. Their legacy isn't just in the fear they inspired but in the cities they built, the cultures they connected, and the ideas they spread. That's the part of their story that lasts, the part that still shapes us today, from our languages to our cities to our sense of what it means to take risks in the face of adversity. It's a reminder that history is rarely simple and that even the most feared figures can leave behind legacies that go far beyond the chaos they once caused. In the end, the Vikings weren't just a storm that passed through medieval Europe. They were a force of change, a messy, often violent, but undeniably transformative chapter in human history. And thanks to discoveries like Somme, we get to see them not as myths or monsters but as people, living in their moment, struggling and striving just like we do now. And that's the story of how a mysterious ship burial on a cold Baltic shore marked the first whispers of what would become the Viking Age. History is never just black and white, it's filled with moments like this, where survival, ambition, and change collide. If you enjoyed uncovering these hidden chapters of the past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us here at Thursday Na Storytime for more fascinating journeys into history's untold stories. Don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments, we'd love to hear what you think. Until next time, keep exploring, keep wondering, and we'll see you in the next story.